Thank you very much, Dr. Vikas Gupta. Uh, it's a pleasure for me that I have been asked to speak in this series. I'm sure the people listening to me know a lot more about the new education policy and have thought a lot more about it than I have done. So, what I shall do is just share a few of my concerns. Uh, Now, in looking at the new education policy, we must remember what the French philosopher Louis Althusser had said, namely that the totality of speech consists both in what is said and what is not said. Therefore, when we look at the new education policy, we have to look at both what it says and what it is silent about. Taking this totality into consideration, it seems to me that this new education policy represents a very significant, major paradigm shift in education in India from the post independence period. And we really now have got a proposal for a completely new paradigm. The earlier paradigm was one which saw, whose conception of education was really that education should help in nation building. Now, one can have a lot of quarrels with this conception. One can have questions about it, but nonetheless, this is something that, roughly speaking, after independence, generally the education policy was such that education was supposed to play this role. Now, what you explicitly have in the education policy is that it must play the role of providing fodder for international capital. And this new conception of education is sought to be covered by having an admixture of Hindutva chauvinism in this education policy, so that this policy represents, to my mind, a mix of neoliberalism and Hindutva chauvinism, and that in the sphere of education is a counterpart of what we find in the sphere of politics, namely that in the country today, political power rests with a Hindutva corporate alliance. So, corresponding to the Hindutva corporate alliance, you now actually have a Hindutva chauvinism combined with neoliberalism as the new conception of education. Now, obviously, one can say that, look, no matter what the post independence education policy promised to do, whatever its conception and so on, there were deep flaws in it. That this nation building is rather a grand concept, and it isn't clear how much our education policy was promoting it. But nonetheless, there are certain important markers which were derived from this conception, which the current education policy very clearly gives up. One such marker was that education should be inclusive. And what is remarkable about the new education policy is that it effectively tries to confine education to a small socially and economically privileged elite. Now, this is clear in the fact that reservations, which until now were a key component of our admission intake and so on, of the education policy, simply do not find a mention in the new education policy. Reservations for Dalits, OBCs, and other categories. Now, of course, there is a lot on socially and economically disadvantaged groups, the SEDGs. But on the other hand, in all that, there is not a mention of reservations or the need for reservations, which makes one suspect, given the way that, for instance, universities again you have been flouting the education norms, that this government is really interested in abandoning the idea of reservations, and the education policy we have is really a pointer to that. Now, associated with this, of course, is privatization of education. Really, a very clear conception of education as being a private activity. As a matter of fact, this is something which the Prime Minister himself explicitly made clear later on, so that this finds reflection in the education. Now, if education is a private activity, if education providers are in fact private individuals, then those private individuals, even those who may be doing it for philanthropic reasons, would be charging high fees that would actually leave out most of the ordinary common people who come particularly from socially and economically deprived backgrounds. Now, of course, the education policy talks about scholarships. But on the other hand, these scholarships are not supposed to come from the government budget. It's not the government that's supposed to provide scholarships, but they are supposed to come essentially from within these educational institutions themselves, which basically means the fees for the others would be even greater. And as a matter of fact, therefore, in every such private educational institution, you would actually have two categories of students, one paying heavy fees. I mean, if at all the scholarship scheme works out, two categories, one paying heavy fees and the other really subsisting on scholarships. And that is something that would actually be against all collegiality. That people paying heavy fees would in fact be saying to the others, sneering at the others, saying that, look, my father pays for your education. So you have a destruction of collegiality if at all this comes into being, which of course would be discouraging, which would discourage people from the socially and economically deprived backgrounds to actually drop out. This is something which the education policy does not recognize, the government does not recognize, that if you are going to have scholarships, they must be out of tax revenue. They must be provided from the public exchequer. If you do not have that, then of course there is no meaning to having a scholarship financed education for large numbers of students. Therefore, these students would really not be finding a place in the education stream. As a matter of fact, when you look at the new education policy, that actually makes provisions for two streams. You know that in now you're going to have state exams in class 3, class 5, class 8 in school itself. And of course, even in the undergraduate course, after the first year and the second year, you can have people dropping out. So it actually provides for people to drop out at various levels. And of course, those who drop out are given a supposed carrot in the name of vocational education, open distance learning, and so on. And likewise, those who drop out in colleges are given a carrot in the form of a certificate or a diploma. But those are basically sort of consolation pieces of paper. Fundamentally, if you drop out, say at the school level, then basically you go on to a vocational education stream which imparts various skills to you. But of course, the sheer imparting of skills does not really constitute the content of education. One can say that education must not only be theoretical, but it must also include practical activity. That's a very important point. But on the other hand, simply providing skills is something that certainly does not constitute education. As a matter of fact, it would give rise to the kind of duality which has really, characterized the Indian education system or the Indian social life for millennia and centuries. Namely, that you have a group of people who are supposed to have education as their privilege, as their prerogative, the Brahmins, the upper castes, and so on. And then you are supposed to have a whole lot of people who belong to the various artisan castes, peasants, and so on, who are basically given skills. So this duality which has characterized Indian society for a very long time, for centuries, is now going to be reproduced in the sphere of education itself, in the form of the fact that some people who get good grades, who come from good backgrounds, who have had good exposure to English or to other kind of conceptual things from childhood, are the ones who actually would go on to impart to get higher education, but on the other hand, the others are supposed to drop out. Now, you may say that open distance learning, after all, is not something which is really, all that bad. But the important point is that education also has a very clear social dimension. Education is not just about simply getting hold of a few ideas from books and so on, but it's also about socialization, the process of socialization. And therefore, if you drop out of the stream of education in educational institutions, then effectively you're really dropping out of the education process. Therefore, there is this kind of duality which this education policy institutionalizes. It is something which, as I said, has characterized our society for centuries. It is something which you could even say always characterized our education system even earlier. But nonetheless, whatever upward mobility the earlier education system provided is now institutionally blocked by this new education policy. Those who would be getting higher education, let us say, who are going to proceed in this education stream as opposed to getting skills of various kinds. Let's just look at what destinies are in store for these two streams. Those who are going to proceed in the higher education stream, let us say, they would be learning from a curriculum which is fundamentally going to be borrowed from the metropolitan capitalist countries. Obviously, that is also the logic of having foreign universities set up campuses in India. If they set up campuses in India, then they are not going to be teaching all kinds of things which are generally supposed to be part of a curriculum or have been part of a curriculum in an Indian university till now. They would then there has to be a commonality in the curricula, and that commonality would actually be dictated by what they are used to. Now, this is an interesting and important point. You see, globalization of capital implies that you need a kind of homogenization of education over a large domain, so that as capital can shift from one country to another, as capital straddles many countries, you should actually have an educated cadre, an educated personnel, a group of educated people that also straddle countries and have a homogeneous education across these countries. If capital locates itself in Hong Kong, then you must have somebody who may be an employee of that capital drawn from India but located in Hong Kong. And therefore, that person should have an education which is comparable or similar or homogeneous with the education that is actually provided in Hong Kong itself. Therefore, a homogenization of education internationally is something which is a requirement of, which is a complement of, a part of the globalization of capital. Now, if you do that, then effectively what you are doing is detaching the curriculum, detaching the education that is provided in India from the Indian reality. Let me give you an example. Now, for instance, I teach economics, and I believe it is impossible for an Indian student of economics to understand the origins of mass poverty in India, to understand even the continuation of poverty in India, without having some idea of the role, let us say, of colonialism, of the fact that colonialism brought about deindustrialization, brought about a significant transfer of surplus on a regular basis every year from India to the metropolitan power, so that you actually have to have a certain understanding of colonialism. Now you tell me in Harvard or Cambridge or Oxford, they don't teach colonialism and its impact in generating mass poverty in India. They haven't heard of Dadabhai Nauroji. They haven't heard of Ramesh Chandra Dutt. And therefore, while every Indian student should know of Dadabhai Nauroji and Ramesh Chandra Dutt, if that student is to understand his own reality and country, you would have an education system where he never even hears of them. And therefore, this education that would be imparted, while it would be in conformity with the requirements of international capital, would be an education that would actually be, that will actually give rise to a lack of knowledge. It will give rise to education as a commodity. It will give rise to uh, an essential ignorance about your own kind of, country. It will make you socially ignorant. On the other hand, and mind you, all this is being done in the name of excellence and world class and so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, implicit in what I'm saying is that the quest for world class is itself a nonsensical quest, because if education is to make you understand the society you live in, then that society has specifically its own history, and therefore world class, which is basically supposed to be this homogeneous education, and having homogeneous criteria to judge the excellence of education, is really inapplicable for a true proper education system. So the quest for world class itself is really pointless, and it is actually harmful. Think of the others who are proceeding along the skills tree. They would be imparted some skills. Now, there is no certainty about their getting jobs. We know that there's an enormous problem of unemployment and labor reserves. In India, of course, labor reserves, or the reserve army of labor that Marx had talked about, takes the form not of some people being fully employed and other people being fully unemployed. So the reserve army of labor in India does not take the form of open unemployment. It takes the form where almost everybody is really employed for only a part of the time. That basically somebody gets work for a few days, not another day. Somebody gets work for a few hours, not for the rest of the day, and so on. So a given amount of work is shared out among most people, with just a tiny fraction having full-time employment, whose employment now is going to become more precarious after the bills the parliament has passed. But the point is, the bulk of the people are really uh, given a form of rationing of jobs, where they are really substantially unemployed for part of the time and employed only for a part of the time. Now, if you impart skills, since there is no certainty of employment, basically you would be providing some kind of skills. Already there are many skilled people among these part-time employed persons, and you'd be adding to their numbers. When you add to their numbers, what happens is that the per capita income, the per capita earnings of these people would be going down. So effectively, you'd be adding to the reserve army of labor, and it will be visible in terms of the fact that the per capita earnings of the swelling reserve army of labor would be going down. So one stream would actually be joining the ranks of people whose incomes are going to keep going down over time. The other stream, of course, would be getting jobs and so on by international capital, but on the other hand, would be completely ignorant as far as their own society is concerned. And this, of course, would mean that those who pursue education are people who would be, on the whole, social conformists. Now, it is this conformism which actually is an extremely important characteristic of this new education policy. As a matter of fact, the idea of having a curriculum detached from your own national social reality is sought to be covered up by saying that no, we must have an education system that actually makes every Indian proud of being an Indian. Every student proud of being an Indian. Now the point is that look, what is this pride? It is basically pride in the glory of ancient India. Now, the Indian history has horrendous features like untouchability, like caste oppression, like gender oppression, like sati, and so on. Now, if India is going to emerge as a modern free nation, then the students must fight against this. Then the educated must fight against this. To fight against this, you must learn to hate this. You must learn to hate caste oppression. You must learn to abhor untouchability and so on and so forth. And you cannot do that if the glory of ancient India is being dinned into you. As a matter of fact, therefore, the whole idea that you would be prettifying the caste system, you'd be actually trying to gloss over the iniquities that have traditionally characterized the Indian society, the horrible, gross iniquities that have characterized Indian society. And therefore, the idea would be to produce students who don't hate these iniquities, but who, on the contrary, are really conformists, who actually glorify, prettify whatever existed in India earlier. In fact, it's a very immature idea. It's actually a tendentious and jejune idea of education that we actually tell students about the great things about India, but we don't tell them the truth about our own history. Education must enable students to look at their own history truthfully and without any adornments. This idea of producing conformists is something which permeates the new education policy document. For instance, you find, even in terms of its institutional features, for instance, you find that now, I mean, one of the things that we have had in many universities, I know in Central University and so on, is this rotation of deanship, rotation of chairpersonship, which actually broke the old feudal subservience. But now the idea is that those with leadership qualities would be entrusted with chairpersonship, deanship, and so on, which is really a revival of feudal subservience. Likewise, you have, for instance, the idea of the tenure track, that you would not get tenure. You would be on a tenure track, which basically means that if you are critical of the government, if you participate in demonstration and so on, in that case, you would be denied tenure. As a matter of fact, this is happening in many of the private universities, and that is now going to be institutionalized. The board of governors are supposed to be very powerful people in all these colleges and universities, private colleges and universities that are coming up. And of course, they again are going to be a force for conformism in all these institutions. Therefore, the whole idea is that the tendency towards the democratization of the universities, which was taking place over the last several decades, is something which is now going to be negated and reversed. Now, the implications of the tendency towards democratization is something I come from JNU. I've actually seen the implications of that tendency towards democratization. It broke fear. It actually enabled students to ask questions. It enabled teachers to feel equal to one another, instead of some people who are deans and chairpersons being bosses and others kowtowing to them. You actually had a level of equality. And this unleashed a lot of intellectual energy. This intellectual energy, for instance, showed itself in a whole lot of innovative, not only teaching and research, but also innovative courses like labor studies, like Dalit studies, like women's studies, and so on. Now, these courses, of course, it is true that you can criticize them, that they split up the conditions of the oppressed into separate categories and boxes, but nonetheless, they did look at the oppressed. As a result, you actually found a burgeoning new areas coming up, with a lot of intellectual activity, a lot of intellectual creative dynamism. Now you'd find that, as a matter of fact, none of these, an education policy document that spends so much time lauding multidisciplinarity does not mention any of these, doesn't mention Dalit studies, doesn't mention women's studies, doesn't mention labor studies. So none of these disciplines, which had actually come up in the last several years and which actually drew some of the best students and were centers of non-conformism, are really even mentioned in the document. Therefore, you actually find that the emphasis of this document is actually on producing a group of conformist students who would then provide fodder for intellectual capital, for international capital. And the point is that, as a matter of fact, conformism is something on which there is a commonality between the Hindutva ideologues on the one hand and neoliberalism on the other hand. Neoliberalism does not like non-conformism. Neoliberalism does not like questions being raised. Likewise, Hindutva does not like questions being raised. And if you raise questions, it's inconvenient. Therefore, the idea is to actually prevent questions, and that is something which this new education policies thrust really is about. The last point I want to talk about is really the enormous centralization that has taken place or that is implicit in the new education. We all know that education is now in the concurrent list of the seventh schedule, but in the formulation of this policy, the state governments were never consulted. As a matter of fact, even the parliament was not consulted. The center on its own, unilaterally, simply formulates an education policy for the country as a whole. We now know that the center is going to formulate the curriculum in future for education everywhere, and the states can only add some local color to it. This curriculum, when it is taught in Kerala, there would be something about Onam. This curriculum, if it's taught in some other state, there'll be something, some local color. But fundamentally, the curriculum is going to be centralized. Likewise, the National Research Foundation, which is supposed to be the apex body of organizing and funding research in the country, would have the Prime Minister as its chairperson. Likewise, if you have the Higher Education Council of India, which is going to be the apex body looking after higher education, is the Union Education Minister who is going to be the chairman of this body. So everywhere there is a tendency towards centralization. The school boards would lose a lot of their relevance because now even admission to undergraduate courses are going to be on the basis of a national test, and therefore your school board results are not going to count so much. Therefore, the whole idea is really to centralize education, and centralization once more goes against any striving for autonomy, I mean intellectual autonomy, for any striving towards sort of, multiple, a spread of a multiplicity of ideas, and it is really an attempt at regimen. So producing conformism on the one hand and centralization on the other hand really complement one another. And the whole idea of this new education policy, to my mind, is really to take several steps backward compared to at least what the education policy earlier had set as its objective and also striven in various ways, no matter how imperfectly, to achieve. As a matter of fact, even the right to education, such as it is, which was introduced by Arjun Singh when he was the education minister, HRD minister, is now diluted in this because, again, as I said, the idea is to have two streams right from the school level itself, from class 3, 5, and 8, through examinations at the state level. So this is, to my mind, Indian education's great leap backwards. And I think this is a point that we have to vote against and, in my view, struggle against. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik, for a very concise but very sharp lecture. But before we open it for discussion, I would request Ramamurthy ji from the Faculty of Education, Delhi University, to give us a Hindi summary translation of your presentation.
The two questions. Say, firstly, it is, that's why I said we have to look at both the words as well as the silences. All right, it is there as far as the various laws are concerned, but then why not mention it? Why is it that the document, which talks at great length about socially and economically disadvantaged groups, does not mention reservations at all? I mean, it is significant because it doesn't mention reservations at all. So, if you are having an education policy, what prevented you from reiterating the fact that reservations have been a very important way in which opportunities have been sought to be made available to the deprived segments? So the point is that, that I'm not persuaded that this is something which is simply taken for granted. There are many things which can be taken for granted, but on the other hand, reservations have always been a contentious issue, and given the contentiousness of reservations, all the more important in education policy to actually assert it. Okay. Uh, Dalit reservations, all right, you can say that the Dalit reservation is something which has been there in the constitution. But on the other hand, many of the newer reservations, OBC reservations for Muslims, for instance, Kerala has reservations for Muslims. Now the point is that does Kerala continue to have reservations for Muslims? So these are very important issues, and they should have been mentioned in the document. Secondly, this Hindutva. I would not use the term nationalism for Hindutva. Hindus are not a nation. Hindutva, people may say that they are talking about a nationalism, but I don't accept it. So I would not use the term Hindutva nationalism. That's why I just keep talking about Hindutva. I draw a distinction between Hinduism and Hindutva. In other words, I talk about Hindutva only in terms of the ideology of this group of people who are currently, in the ascendancy in the nation. But I do not talk in terms of Hinduism. Hinduism is a religion. Hindutva is the deliberate use of religious feelings of people for political ends by a particular group of people. And actually, my own view is that I would really call this group of people fascists. So, but on the other hand, this has aroused a lot of controversy, which is why I didn't use the term fascist. But on the other hand, this is exactly what many fascist ideologies do. I mean, after all, for instance, behind Trump, there are all kinds of extreme right wing Christian groups who would like to use Christianity to beat down the blacks, to beat down the immigrants, and so on. But on the other hand, attacking their Christian fundamentalism is not the same as attacking Christianity. So, in making people, in taking issues to the people, uh, we have to draw a distinction between the Hindutvavadis and the Hindus. The Hinduism as a religion, and of course, these Hindutvavadis who are trying to exploit religion for political ends.
Yeah, there is a question from Surjit. Shashank, you can read it, I think. It's there in the chat box.
NEP 2020 is not yet tabled in the parliament, but government gives us an impression that it is already a policy in the process of implementation. Is it possible to bypass the parliament? That is the question from Surjit.
And it's not
Uh,
an impression; they are actually implementing it.
Yeah, I mean, they have actually said that it is a policy. Parliament met after the new education policy had been promoted, but it was not on the parliament's agenda. So it's very clearly an accepted policy, and they have bypassed parliament. After all, I mean, they are bypassing parliament on a number of issues. So that's nothing new.
Today there is the latest announcement. Okay.
yes,
Acha,
sir.
you ask. Yeah.
Actually, I had two thoughts. One was around the Hindutva question that Prabhat sir was actually trying to elicit around. Uh, Clara Zetkin has always told that there will be a contradiction between the capitalistic force, neoliberal capitalistic forces, and then the fascist forces. But do we see any sense of that in playing out in the Indian context? That was one. And secondly, sir. For whatever reasons, though I am not a personal advocate for private institutions, especially coming from philosophical or philanthropic perspectives, be it run from the minority religious communities or even the majority religious community running on a philanthropic basis. I believe that this NEP is also washing these philanthropic initiatives away by making it a very easier ground for the corporate model based university systems. So I wanted to
Yes, okay. Your second question, I completely agree that we have to draw a distinction between the right of minority institutions, I mean, right of minority religions to run institutions, which is guaranteed to them by the constitution, and the privatization that is taking place now, which is basically corporate driven privatization. This is something which sometimes gets used. For instance, in Kerala, when the government had brought in a bill to regulate fees and admission and so on in universities, that bill was actually rejected in the High Court because of the fact that it violated the rights of minority religions from the it was an interference. Obviously, the idea of the bill was to regulate all private institutions, but on the other hand, other private institutions took shelter behind the minority private institutions, and therefore that bill got turned down. And really, up to this moment, there is no regulation of fees or admission policies and so on anywhere. Uh, this document does talk about regulating fees, but it doesn't really set up any particular specific mechanism for it. Your first question is, of course, a very important question. That's the relation between neoliberalism and fascism. Now, I believe that fascism, okay, the justification of neoliberal policies for a very long time was that, look, it has brought us so much growth. I mean, after all, the trickle down that okay, some people may be benefiting from it disproportionately for the time being, but of course, sooner or later, it will trickle down to everybody. Even to this day, the kind of justification for neoliberalism is that neoliberalism broke with the old Hindu rate of growth, I mean, so-called Hindu rate of growth, which is just a term. But on the other hand, in the process of its doing so, what people don't mention is that the level of hunger in the country has gone up in the neoliberal period. But on the other hand, the point is that neoliberalism is still justified in terms of a high rate of growth. Now, that worked for quite some time. But that high rate of growth justification is something that was really becoming invalid for quite some time. The Indian economy has been slowing down for quite some time. Therefore, when neoliberalism runs into a crisis, and this crisis has been going on for some time, then it needs additional props for itself, additional ways of promoting, or sustaining its acceptability in a society or in an economy. And one such prop it has is the alliance with the Hindutvawadis. So the Hindutvawadis are arch neoliberal, and at the same time, they are forever trying to bring about a discourse shift whereby really the enemy is the other, the enemy is the Muslim, the enemy is Dalit, the enemy is, whoever, all kinds of marginal groups, the intellectuals, the artists, the free thinkers, and so on. So the point is that they actually demonize particular social groups, and whatever is the limitation of the economic system is now really attributed to these demonized groups. And that is why neoliberalism requires an alliance with these kinds of forces. And therefore, the turn towards fascism is really a symptom of neoliberalism in crisis.
I think Ramurthy sir
I
had
think,
a
yeah.
question. Ramurthy sir, if you can unmute and ask your.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, yes,
Yeah, I
yes.
have two questions to ask, sir. One, in order to legitimize this policy, they claim that they have consulted more than 2 lakh people, including some states, particularly about some 7 states and one parliament. And how do you look at this? What is their claim, particularly of this of 2 lakh people? Second, and two more small questions related specifically to the economy. One is that did you come across any study or did you try to look at it at any level that is it really possible to finance the higher education in particular? Because it is they are trying to make a falsifiable claim as if the public funding of higher education is equivalent to impossible to be funded by government. Therefore, we will have to include the private player. So the rational bit is being created or propagated that it is not possible for government to fund the higher education. So how would you like to look at this rational? And third and last, the people like Gita Gandhi Kingdom, about whom you know.
Okay. Yeah.
Ramurthy sir, you have gone on
Okay.
mute. But by
Your
that time, Prabhat sir can answer.
your first question is that they have consulted more than 2 lakh people, but on the other hand, at the end of those consultations, Mr. Kasturi Rangan, who was the chairman of the earlier committee, had actually said that we didn't find anything very worthwhile to incorporate into the new document on the basis of this consultation. So you can consult any number of people, but if you're not willing to listen to them, then what's the point of these consultations? So these numbers themselves don't really mean anything. I don't know how many people they consulted, whether they actually consulted 2 lakh people or not. But on the other hand, they have not incorporated any of the concerns and worries and so on which were raised vis-a-vis the earlier document that Kasturi Rangan Committee had authored last year, which was made available in 2019. Second question you raised, I think it's a very important question, but on the other hand, it's a totally bogus argument. Okay, let me explain why. You know, in fact, I made an estimate along with a colleague that basically, suppose we have right to education as for which we set aside 6% of GDP, which is exactly what the Kothari Commission had recommended, the Taposh Majumdar Commission has reiterated, and so on. But not just education. Suppose we take 5 fundamental economic rights. One is right to education, the other is right to employment, the third is right to uh, food And the fourth is right to free, universal, publicly funded healthcare through an NHS, National Health Service. And the five is a right to old age pension and disability benefits, where the old age pension is 3,000 rupees per month compared to the pittance today, which is 500 rupees. So if you take these rights, then we found that in addition to what the government is spending, whatever is being spent at the moment by the central government on all these various heads, we didn't even take into account what is being spent by the state governments, but just take what is being spent by the central government. In addition to what is being spent, you would require 10% of the GDP. 10% extra of the GDP is what you would require to realize all these five fundamental economic rights. Now, there's a proposition in economics that if you need to spend 10% of GDP, then you can actually mobilize resources which don't have to be 10% of GDP. They'll have to be, by our calculation, very conservative calculation, about 7% of GDP. 7% of GDP implies that once you spend this 7%, then you get 3% in the form of taxation, in which case 7 plus 3 would give you 10%. So you can spend what you get additionally on top of the 7%. So 7% of GDP is the additional resource you can mobilize. And this, we found, you can mobilize through two simple taxes. One is a wealth tax. Take the top 1% of the wealth holders, just the top 1%. Look at the amount of the wealth they have and impose a 2% wealth tax on the wealth of the top 1% of the wealth holders. And the second is that if you have a wealth tax, you must also have an inheritance tax. If you have because otherwise they just distribute their wealth among their children and so on. So if you have an inheritance tax, then the inheritance tax we assume is that take whatever is given every year distributed among children and so on, because someone dies, just take 1/3 of that wealth as inheritance tax. I should say that in all major capitalist countries, you have wealth tax and you have inheritance tax. And what is more, in countries like Japan, 80% is the inheritance tax. That means if wealth is passed down in a particular year to a person dies, his wealth goes to his children, then 80% of it is taken by the state. In India, we have zero. Zero. So you just take these two taxes, 2% wealth tax on the top 1% of the population, and 1/3 inheritance tax, again on the top 1% of the population, then you find that you would be able to raise 7% of GDP. India can become a welfare state on the basis of these two taxations. And India, as you know, does not have any wealth tax, does not have any inheritance tax. It's actually, it's shocking. People, economists who come from abroad and who look at the Indian reality are absolutely shocked that a country with such extreme inequalities has zero wealth tax and zero inheritance tax. So this whole idea that where are the resources is a completely bogus idea. As a matter of fact, we have plenty of resources.
Very, very interesting, I think, responses. Uh, if there are other questions, I think we can take now. Otherwise, I think there are no in the chat box. So in case anyone wants to unmute, you can quickly raise your questions.
I think there is one from Facebook again.
Okay. Okay. Just read that. Read that.
When the NEP tries to institutionalize political component of Hindutva in education, Hindutva is also rooted in the Brahminical superiority that Hinduism legitimizes. Thus, is it possible to draw a line between the religion and the political project, which both supplement each other and have also given rise to the power of the ruling regime in the recent times?
No, I think it should be possible because, after all, it is true. It is true that in Hinduism there is a very strong. Hinduism, according to a very well-known historian in my university, Suviraj Jaiswal, the essence of Hinduism is the caste system. Therefore, Hinduism is basically, I mean, the caste system is rooted in Hinduism. But nonetheless, the fact remains that everything said and done, in when India became independent, we actually had a constitution that created a fraternity of equal citizens. I know I was a little kid when the 1952 elections happened. And at that time, I know the kind of shock that the Brahmins in my village had, that the Dalits vote had the same weight as their own vote. So it was, in a certain sense, India did witness a social revolution in giving an equal weight to the vote of a Dalit and the vote of a Brahmin. And therefore, it created citizenship on a modern basis. And in a sense, that was acceptable to the majority Hindu population. But Hindutva is really a very different thing. That it's not as if the Indian freedom struggle and whatever was achieved after that in the form of the constitution was done by rejecting Hinduism. No, I mean, you had a secular constitution, but on the other hand, there was no attack on Hinduism as such. Or on the contrary, as a matter of fact, there was a movement for reform in the Hindu uh, code bill and so on. But on the other hand, Hindutva really wants a political reassertion of an institution where equality of citizenship is denied. So Hindutva is a political project. It's a political project against the constitution. While Hinduism is something that actually tolerated, if you like, accepted the constitution that provided equal rights to all citizens. So I would like to draw a distinction between this. Of course, there will be tensions between Hinduism and the secular constitution and so on. There may be tensions, but these tensions have been managed, were managed, and should be managed. But Hindutva is an aggressive rejection of the fundamental constitutional guarantee of equality to all citizens.
I think now Professor Jagmohan can present the vote of thanks and close with his closing remarks for today's wonderful webinar.
I, on behalf of the All India Forum for Right to Education, is really grateful to Professor Prabhat Patnaik for such a illuminating and insight view on this national education policy. It is a great honor for the All India because he is also part of our uh, guiding force, and this will enrich the uh, the critical appraisal which we are making on national education policy, and this will be. I'm thankful to him and all discussers who have raised very important point, and many things have come up on that. There has been a very good response on uh, the Facebook also. There have been about 20 to 30 people who have been listening to it live over there. So I think the one point which I would like to make is that how do we see it in a recolonization process? Because instead of producing excellence and talking about fourth industrial revolution, where a more higher inputs are required, we are trying to make it, and will that be again? And as I am from a computer sciences, with all our computer force, we have not a single software developed. Whereas we are serving those institutions which are in that. Is it really to be seen that the whole our freedom movement was a denationalizing process? All those process was introduced. and it is almost looks to me that we are recolonizing that, and in that process, we would like to have sometime more deeper discussion. But Dr. Professor Prabhat Patnaik, we are thankful to you for actually raising very pertinent question, which will be, and we are actually working on in All India Forum to Right to Education, that what type of alternative uh, strategy of education or a policy of education and an alternative be developed. So I think we will be again approaching you for helping us in drafting that also. So thank you very much, everybody,